Welcome back to another Behind the Curtains episode of B2B Growth. If you have not been subscribed for long, I will give you a little bit of context. Most of our episodes during the week are interviews with VPs of marketing, CMOs, CEOs of fast-growing B2B companies. But on the weekends, either myself and Logan, our director of partnerships at Sweetfish, will do a kind of behind the scenes, if you will, of our own business, what we're learning, how we're growing as leaders. And so that's what this episode is. So in today's episode, I'm going to be covering 7 resources for the Christian leader. So this is something, I'm obviously a Christian and I'm very passionate about my faith. And so, but I don't hear a lot of people outside of Christian circles talking about their Christian resources that are helping them. I think there's actually an enormous opportunity for kind of Christian resources in the business world, and so wanted to put out an episode of my 7 favorite resources that I think every Christian leader should be consuming. And so I've got 3 podcasts and 4 books that I'm going to be sharing in this episode. So if you are a Christian leader, this is definitely an episode for you. So I'll start by sharing the podcasts that are incredibly valuable for me as a Christian leader. I'll start by talking about the Groeschel Leadership Podcast. Now, this particular podcast, even if you are not a Christian, you are going to get an enormous amount of value from this podcast. But the reason I put it on the list is because Groeschel is actually a pastor. He was the pastor at my church when I was living in Oklahoma. I want to say it's actually the largest church in the country now. I think it was number 2 or 3 for a bit, and I think they just became the largest church in the U.S. Multiple campuses across the country, and just an incredible leader. His podcast, he spends hours and hours and hours researching and just putting in an enormous amount of effort to put out every month. He puts out 2 episodes. Those episodes are, I think, 15 to 20 minutes, but the content is just exceptional. He doesn't talk, honestly, he doesn't really talk a lot about the church. It comes up because he's a pastor and leading one of the largest churches in the world. But even if you are not a Christian, I would strongly recommend that you go subscribe to the Groeschel Leadership Podcast. His last name is spelled Groeschel. So search for that podcast, check it out. I think you'll get an enormous amount of value from it, even if you're not a Christian. The second podcast that I want to talk about is a podcast called The Faith-Driven Entrepreneur. This is a newer podcast for me. I've not been listening to it for long, but it has been incredibly useful for me up to this point. It is, I want to say, a group of 3 or 4 gentlemen that have conversations around a variety of different topics. I've got it pulled up in my podcast player right now. I'll just share. So it looks like their last episode was about performance reviews. Another episode, they talk about the 40-hour work week and what that means to a Christian business owner, a Christian leader. They have a episode titled "Equally Yoked in Business." So lots of really quality episodes. I've gotten a lot of value from this show. The third podcast that I'll share here is a podcast that actually one of my best friends actually hosts, and it's called Theology for the Rest of Us. And Kenny, in this show, he unpacks just theological truths to folks that are not necessarily, they wouldn't consider themselves to be theologians, and he does an incredible job of unpacking ideas that honestly, in church circles get talked about in ways that folks that didn't go to seminary don't necessarily understand. But Kenny does an exceptional job of distilling down the truth of theology and helping the normal guy like myself who didn't go to seminary understand some of these theological concepts and ideas. So looking back at his last few episodes, he's got an episode titled "Did Adam and Eve Really Exist?" He's got another episode called "What Happened to the Dinosaurs?" and "What About Dragons?" Again, he's approaching all of these from a theological perspective. He's got one here called "What is Naturalism?" So a lot of really great topics that he covers on this show, and so I would absolutely recommend it. Full disclosure, I went to dinner with him tonight. He's a great friend of mine, but that is not why I think his show is extremely valuable. I think the content stands for itself. So definitely check that out. Theology for the Rest of Us. You can find that show. It's hosted by Kenny Ortiz. All right, so now I want to talk about the 4 books on my list. The first book that I want to talk about is other than the Bible, my favorite book of all time, and it's a book called Love Does by Bob Goff. This is the book that actually inspired me to start my very first company, a company called Worth Day, and what Bob does in this book, I've got a Love Does kind of desk calendar sitting on my desk right now that my sister bought me. But this book talks about love as an action, and Bob shares just story after story of people that have chosen to love well, and actively loved the people around them, be it family or strangers, and so it's an incredible book. I think I would say even it does have a lot of Jesus language in it. So if you're listening to this, you don't necessarily subscribe to the Christian faith. I think you should still read this book, just because it will inspire you to love the people around you better. But it does again have a lot of Christian verbiage in the book. So I know that can kind of rub people the wrong way if they don't know getting into it. But it does have that kind of vibe. But just an incredible book. Completely changed my perspective on how I should be loving the people around me. If you're leading a team, how you can love your team better, how you can love your family better, how you can love anybody better. These stories are incredibly inspiring. I would definitely recommend Love Does to anybody. Another book that I absolutely love is called Leadership Axioms. Again, this book is a phenomenal read for anyone, even if you're not a Christian. But the book is written by a pastor of a large church, and this book is very, very short chapters. But inside of these chapters, there's just incredible wisdom. I just opened up the book; it's on my desk, and it looks like chapter 38 is titled "Real-Time Coaching." And so this guy Bill Hybels that wrote the book just unpacks real-time coaching, the principle of real-time coaching, how it is worked in his organization, which is a large mega church. But there's just so much good stuff in this book. This is one of those books you don't need to read cover to cover. Oftentimes I just randomly open it up and we'll read a random chapter. It is my beach read, so whenever I go to the beach, I take this book with me, because I know even if I get 1 or 2 chapters in, because they're only 1 or 2 page chapters, I can just have an enormous amount of wisdom to go implement in our business. So Leadership Axioms, Axioms, written by a gentleman named Bill Hybels. Definitely suggest you check that book out. All right, so the next book that I want to talk about, I've talked about Love Does, talked about Leadership Axioms. This next book is called 5 Dates. The subtitle of this book is Don't Work on Your Problems, Work on Your Togetherness. This is a book that I recently read. It is a marriage book. I think if you are a Christian leader, if you're any leader, I think you need to be investing in your marriage if you are married. And this book is written from a Christian perspective by Mike and Jennifer Foster. There is a men's version of the book written by Mike, and there is a women's version of the book written by Jennifer. And so I have read the men's version. My wife has read the women's version, or I think she's still in the middle of reading the women's version. And it gives you 5 specific types of dates that you and your spouse should be proactively going on to actively invest in your marriage and nurture your relationship with one another. It had a ton of takeaways after reading it. So that book is called 5 Dates by Mike and Jennifer Foster. If you buy the bundle, I think you get both of the books. I think regardless of whether there's a bundle package and there's another package, I think either way you're gonna get both of the books. So that is my third book suggestion, and my fourth book suggestion and final suggestion of this episode is a book that I recently finished up, written by a gentleman named Jordan Rayner, and it is a book called Called to Create. And this book is specifically for Christian entrepreneurs. And so, Jordan struggled early in his career with feeling like the only way he could contribute to the kingdom of God was by starting a church or being a pastor, and really wrestled through, what it would look like to carry his faith into business, and is starting businesses, running businesses, and has had a very successful business career. And this book really talks about his journey to realizing that God has called us to create, and we don't have to do that in a church context to follow the calling that God's given us. So it was an exceptional book. It's on Audible, so I actually listened to that one on my last few plane trips, and just finished that one up. Exceptional read. So to recap all of these, my 3 podcast suggestions are Craig Groeschel's Leadership Podcast, The Faith-Driven Entrepreneur, and Theology for the Rest of Us. My 4 book suggestions for Christian leaders: Love Does, 5 Dates, Leadership Axioms, and Called to Create by Jordan Rayner. If you have any questions about these, feel free to shoot me an email, james@sweetfishmedia.com. Would absolutely love to hear from you, but I hope these resources are incredibly helpful for you.